Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to this session, which is on the do's and don'ts of being an effective participant in the IEP process. And just a little bit about myself. I come from Illinois, where today it's a lot colder than it is here. And I've been in special education, working with children with disabilities for a long time. For those of you, was anybody in my session yesterday? So if you were, you know I love working with children with behavior problems. And the other thing that I love doing is what I call legislative advocacy for children. And the reason that I do legislative advocacy is because of a little girl by the name of Sally. And Sally was in my first classroom that I taught many years ago. And it was a classroom for children who had autism, only they didn't say autism back then. They said, oh, those children are autistic-like. Well, the children had autism. They also had a number of other disabilities. And so I started teaching around the time that the law came into effect that said that all children had the right to go to school. And so I had a little girl coming to my classroom for the first time at the age of 10. And the sad part of this story is this little girl's mother would take her to school because this mother had 10 children living in southern Illinois, and where I was teaching. And every year, the school building principal would take one look at her and say, she can't come to school, because she had cerebral palsy, she had an unrepaired cleft palate, she had very little speech and language, she had a lot of behavior problems, and she also had intellectual disabilities. So her mother, from the time she was kindergarten age until 10, she'd take her to the school would say, can't educate her, take her back home. Sally's mother would take her back home. Sally's mother was persistent, though. Every year this happened. Finally, when she was 10, when there was a law that said all children had the right to go to school, Sally got to go to school. Now, what do we know about the importance of early intervention? She made great progress, but unfortunately, she could have made a lot better progress if we could have served her early. So a lot of people today take for granted that we're always going to have laws that protect children with disabilities. And when people say that, I always remember Sally, and Sally is really the reason that I'm very involved in legislative advocacy. Now I have to tell you another story. It was my goal to write a special education law book made easy. So Brooks Publishing, who is here, said, well, yeah, go for it. We'd like for you to have get a book out on special ed law made easy. So I started writing it, and I thought, uh-oh. This can't be called special ed law made easy because sometimes our laws are not easy, are they? So I wrote the book, and it's, again, your classroom guide to special education law. So change the title. I didn't want it to deceive anybody that this was easy because frankly, about the time we think we've got everything figured out, like working with children with behavior problems, that you could have in terms of a law issue, there's something new that comes out and we're not sure what we're supposed to do. So we're going to talk about the do's and don'ts because I take the IEP process very seriously. I get upset when I hear people say, oh no, I gotta do another IEP. And we probably have all said that, haven't we? How? Another IEP today. And it hits me that we're talking about the life of a child. I mean, what more important responsibility could we have? Those decisions that we make in that IEP team are going to impact that child's life for the rest of it. So we have to take that very seriously. And sometimes, do you feel a bit overwhelmed with the decisions you're asked to make? There actually was a wonderful article written some time ago. It was called Decision Fatigue. Now, what does it mean in terms of the IEP process? How many of you have had to do 5 IEPs in one day? Anybody? Yeah. Now, do you really think that the IEP at the beginning of the day is the same as the one at the end of the day? Probably not. Why? I mean, we're human beings. We're tired, aren't we? So decision fatigue is a reality, and I often think about it, and there have been days, because I've written a lot of IEPs in my day, and that by golly, I was tired. And, I think, I wonder whether the decision, that we made as a group when we were all tired was a quality decision as if we would have made it early in the day. So it's a reality about decision fatigue, which says to us we really need to be careful of how many IEPs we schedule in one day. So, now, first of all, in special education, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is going to get you in big trouble. I had a call from a parent who was an attorney. And he went into the school and he said, my child needs to be evaluated, and I would like for the school to evaluate my child. And the building principal, who is a really, frontline person, guess what the building principal said? Well, we don't do those. In this school district, kind of like we don't do windows, we don't do evaluations. You'll have to get it done independently. Did he just put the school district on the line because of that? Yes, he did. Do we have any building administrators in here? You mean like the building principal?
Like that principal?
The principal of the school, right? I call him a building principal because you have individual school buildings and sorry, thank you for asking me that. So building principals, like in Illinois, we have Lincoln schools all over the state. I wonder why, because we're Abraham Lincoln territory. So there's a Lincoln school, so those would be buildings. So, but that administrator in that school district is the front line person, and ignorance was not bliss, especially when the parent was an attorney. Not a good idea. Because when we don't know the laws and regulations, can we get ourselves in trouble? Especially, how many of you are working with families who know the laws and regulations? So we, as school folks, better know them. Or the worst thing we can do is fake our knowledge of the information. I learned that going to Springfield, Illinois, testifying. And you'd be testifying in front of a bunch of legislators, which is overwhelming. And they'd ask you a question, and your biggest fear was, oh, they're going to ask me a question, I don't know. And invariably, they would ask something. And I learned you better not fake the answer, because that will catch up with you. You better say, I don't know, and I'll be happy to get back to you. See, a lot of educators get themselves into some jams because the parent has a methodology that they want used in a classroom. And we either pretend that we know what that methodology is, or we say, well, we're not going to do that when we don't know what that methodology is. So don't ever fake. And then it's important to stay current because laws and regulations change. We get court cases that impact what we do. So very important knowing what we're doing. Just some of the resources, having an actual copy of the laws and regulations, you know, they're somewhat easy to access now online, but you have to know what you're looking for. And when somebody says to you, the law says this, anybody ever heard that? Well, the law says this. And my answer is always, show me where the law says this. Because a lot of people, we had a school district that will remain nameless who sent out this new set of policies and procedures in their school district, some of which were problematic. Some of them, in fact, were against the law. And so I'm getting all these emails from people saying, did the law change on doing evaluations? I said, no. Well, we were told the law changed on doing evaluations. Didn't happen. So be very careful. Check things out yourself. Engaging in professional development like you're doing in organizations and keeping current blogs. How many of you belong to some blogs? Yeah, what do you belong to? Okay. No, that's okay. That's okay. I mean, there are a variety of them out there. You know, I belong to a number of them. Belong to a number of now Facebook groups that deal with special ed law. So you kind of see what some of the issues are. But you have to keep current because things change. Okay, we're going to do some alphabet soup. How many of these acronyms do you know? Just talk at your table for a minute or two to see if you know what these terms mean. Okay, everybody ready? What's FAPE? Free, appropriate public education. What's it mean? At no cost to the family. The kind of the backbone of special education is free, appropriate public education. How about IDEA? Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now remember, incidentally, we've not had a reauthorization since 2004. So when it was passed in 2004, it actually is IDEIA. People said, oh, that's like EIEIO. So we'll just shorten it to Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, I heard some discussion about what is that FERPA? Anybody know FERPA? Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Most of you, if you've had any medical issues, you're familiar with HIPAA. FERPA is like HIPAA in the educational system. Incidentally, schools have to follow HIPAA too. But Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, about what constitutes a child's record and what doesn't constitute a child's record, etc. BIP, Behavior Intervention Plan, anytime behavior impedes learning. How about LRE? Yeah, least restrictive environment, FAPE in the LRE. You've heard the song Born in the USA, FAPE in the LRE. So, okay. How about ADA? Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a really very, very important law because it impacts schools in a multitude of ways in terms of their employment of staff and the ability of staff to receive access to accommodations. And how about CAP? Good? Oh, that is a good try. It's a good try. Anybody know this one? Pardon? And that is a good one too. But CAP is the Continuum of Alternative Placements, meaning it's really a very important concept because it means that schools have to have options, plural, for children's placements. So they can't say, oh, that child has learning disabilities. Everybody with learning disabilities goes here. Everybody with intellectual disabilities goes here. Everybody this goes here. We can't say that because what? Our services are individualized. This one drives me up a wall because a lot of people will say continuum of alternative services, and there's a huge difference. Continuum of alternative services, some people say, meaning we're going to deliver all the continuum in the general ed classroom. But continuum of alternative placements, remember that whole framework that we have about can be services in the general ed classroom with consultation, could be resource services, could be an instructional class, could be home hospital services. But the bottom line is schools have to have options for children. They can't just say one option. So we do have a lot of alphabet soup, do we not? My husband was not in special education. However, ask me if he's had to learn the jargon. Oh, yes, because, I spout it out, and he'll say, remember, when you go over to the Capitol to talk to legislators, don't be talking in that jargon, because they're not going to understand what you're talking, because they don't eat, sleep, and breathe FAPE in the LRE. They have their own jargon. So, okay, so here's kind of my framework of what we all have to follow. So first of all, we have federal laws and regulations, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Then we have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which 20 years ago, I will tell you, people didn't talk a lot about in the schools. And now it was like the sleeping dog has awakened, because now with more children having disabilities that don't necessarily adversely impact their educational performance, but they still need accommodations, we have many more requests for Section 504 accommodation plans. For children with diabetes, for children with asthma, for children with peanut allergies, a lot of those issues that are out there And I will tell you, not that I really ever want to go to due process with on IDEA, but you never want Office for Civil Rights on your doorstep. That's not pretty. Not pretty at all. I had another school district some years ago. There was a child with diabetes in a classroom. And the classroom teacher said, I have a rule in my class, everybody gets their work done before they go to lunch. But this teacher had a child with diabetes. Now, what do we know about people with diabetes have to eat on time, right? And the teacher said, this is the way it's going to be. I've been teaching 30 years, and I'm not changing. And the superintendent called and said, can I go along with this? And I said, it's not like Avon calling. You do not want the Office for Civil Rights calling you. Settle it. I'm happy to come and talk to this teacher because sometimes when the Office for Civil Rights comes into a school district, they will not only look at that discriminatory issue, but they may look at a lot of other issues as well within your school. Because what that teacher was doing was straight discrimination against the student with diabetes. And we're going to talk about some other of those. ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. ADA together with Section 504 can sometimes get some school districts in trouble without realizing it when they have public events. So here is my example. I work in the Jacksonville, Illinois community, and we have the Illinois State School for the Deaf, and we have a strong deaf community in Jacksonville. And so schools will decide to have open houses. Do they have to have an interpreter? Absolutely, they do have to have an interpreter. They say, well, this is a school event. I said, it's open to the public, correct? Yes. You have to have an interpreter. And in our state, frankly, we have an additional law that says if you have an interpreter who does not have the appropriate license to be interpreting what they are interpreting, they will be fined significantly. So, we have a lot of those things. Building accessibility is a big issue, etc. Particularly in schools that might be older and they're finding it's expensive to retrofit those school districts, but do they have to be accessible? The biology class is up on second floor. There is no elevator. And we have a student with a wheelchair. That means that is not accessible for that student. Problematic. And then FERPA, because we have to know what records we can release, to whom we can release those records. So then you say, oh gosh, that's a lot of federal laws and regulations, isn't it? Oh, that's not all. Then California has its own set of laws and regulations that can always go beyond the federal level. They can't do less. They can do more, but they cannot do less. And then we also have all the court cases that come along. Out of California, we've had some pretty significant court cases. So we have court cases, and then we have letters of interpretation. Anybody familiar with those? Office for Special Education Programs at the federal level occasionally comes out with a letter when people say, well, I read the IDEA and I thought it said this, and somebody else says, oh, no, it doesn't say that, it says this. Oh no, it means this. When that happens, the Office of Special Ed Programs comes out with letters. So to keep up with those, again, you want to belong to professional organizations, you want to join in on blogs, etc. Now, okay, time for another quiz. Look at these and figure out which of these is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, or whether it's a requirement of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. You can talk at your table for a minute about it. Okay, everybody ready? How about 13 different types of disabilities? IDA, whoa, way to go. How about comparable education? Woo-hoo-hoo. Comparable education is Section 504. Says, what do other students get? So in other words, we cannot say that everybody makes the football team, but we can say everybody can try out for the football team because that's comparable to other students. How about the IEP? Yeah, that's IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And how about birth to death? 504, much longer period of time. For when we're working with families, I think it is very difficult when some families have the realization that when their children get out of school, they're not going to get an individualized education plan. They're not going to be or they should not be discriminated against. But that thorough plan isn't going to be there for them. So it's kind of a tough realization. But do they have rights? Will they have rights? Absolutely. They certainly will have rights. Now, it's like cherry pie. And sorry, I couldn't put cherry pies in my suitcase, so you've just got to imagine this. People say, what's the tie-in between those laws and those regulations? And some people use regulations as the same as law, and they're not. And then some people use court cases as the same. So you say, what's the difference between laws and regulations and court cases and all that stuff? Okay. So do I have any other lovers of cherry pie? I got to tell you, actually, I wrote a murder mystery about somebody being poisoned with a cherry pie. But just a little aside here. So now, visualize a cherry pie. It's actually one of the few pies that I can make successfully, except the night I was making it at 10 o'clock at night and put salt instead of sugar in it. But that's another whole story. Anyway, so here's the scoop. If you think about the cherry pie, it has a bottom crust. That's the foundation, right? That's the law, that bottom crust. Now, you know, we get the laws, but then people say, well, we got to interpret those laws, and we have to interpret those laws by writing more regulations. Those are the cherries in the pie. They fill in the bottom pie crust. Now, then we say, oh, notice that we have a top crust, and those are the court cases that help define what the laws and the regulations, the bottom crust, the cherries, and then we have the top crust, which is the court cases. Notice, but that's a lattice top, or if you made a cherry pie and you put a whole top pie crust on it, what do you have to do? You're still going to have to put holes in it because the court cases still don't resolve all of the issues that are out there. If it did, you know, we wouldn't be going to court as often as we sometimes do. So it's like cherry pie. So now, what are the roles and responsibilities of people who go into the IEPs? Have you ever known people that go into the IEP and say, I don't know anything about this child, all I'm here is to sit and I'm the general ed representative, but don't know the first thing about the child? Or the principal who comes in and, have you ever had a revolving door IEP? You know, where people are bebopping in and out. Well, I only got 5 minutes, so I can sit in here for 5 minutes. And therefore, are they really active participants in the process? No, they are not. I mean, this is a serious responsibility. I was visiting with a principal the day after an IEP, and he said, it is just terrible. I did not agree that this child had a learning disability. I said, well, did you speak up? Let me see the IEP. He signed off that he agreed with the eligibility. I said, well, it says right here, you agreed with the eligibility. Well, I really didn't, but I signed on to it anyway. Whoa. Why are you doing something if you don't agree? So that responsibility to be an IEP team member is a heavy responsibility. So you're an evaluator and you say, well, I've never had the child before. I don't know anything about him. Well, if you're going into that IEP, you have a responsibility to learn something about the IEP or to learn something about that child. There are hopefully records there, and if there are no records where children, now this may not happen in California, but it does happen in the state of Illinois where children move frequently, like 6, 7, 8 times a year. You can't move the records fast enough. And so a colleague of mine wrote and said, we don't have any records on this child. I want to request that they postpone the IEP. Is that reasonable? I said, well, yeah, if you have nothing on the child, you need to get some information, because how could you make a decision? You know, a doctor wouldn't make a decision on treatment if they didn't know anything. So you're an evaluator, and your role as an evaluator may just be to review records, but you're still an evaluator. And then you're a required IEP team member and a contributor. Have you ever sat in, the ones that drove me nuts were the ones where somebody come into the IEP and you could tell they were ticked off, but they were not going to say one word in the IEP. And then the next day even, well, that was a waste of my time. You know, I don't agree with anything that was done. Well, you sat there and said nothing. I mean, you are an active participant. So if the group goes along with something and you don't agree with it and you sit there and keep your mouth shut, you know, I'm going to tell you, if you end up in due process, guess what they're going to say? Oh, I see you agreed with that, Catherine. Well, no, I really didn't. Well, did you speak up? No, I didn't want to say anything. Now, we all know that there are nice ways to speak up by asking more questions in the process because you can be a questioner. Yes?
How about teachers, Joan? Our teachers who are invited to the IEP meeting, and prior to the IEP meeting, they're always complaining. They send you emails, oh, he's horrible, he's
Mm-hmm.
this, he's that. They complain about the child. The day of the IEP, when you need them to talk about it, no, he's so sweet. He doesn't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And we've all seen those too, have we not? But if you're not sure about something, do you have a responsibility to ask questions? Sure, you do. I mean, the more you can know about the child, the better. And you're an implementer. It's spelled out on the IEP who's doing what. So you're going to say, I didn't know I was supposed to do that. Well, it should be written down, and the person who is responsible for managing the IEP should be telling people who is responsible for what. And then identifying the supports needed and monitoring. Now, back in 1997, something happened to IEPs, and it was known as this. We no longer just said that we're here today to talk about the needs of Jeremy. We're here today also to talk about the needs of Catherine, who's going to serve Jeremy. And why did that happen? So now we not only talk about what are the supports the child needs, but there is a provision in the law that says we talk about the supports that the teacher needs. And it came from the National Education Association, and it came from the American Federation of Teachers because it was inclusion gone wrong in some places. Here's how it worked. Can I pick on you? Sure. What's your name? Cheryl. Cheryl, you are a wonderful, wonderful fourth grade teacher. Oh, by the way, Cheryl, tomorrow you're going to have a child with autism in your classroom. Cheryl says, I have no training working with children with autism. Good teacher, figure it out. You'll figure it out on your own. See you around. That's not saying it was happening here, but I'm going to tell you, obviously, it was happening a lot of places, and those teachers' organizations says, no, no, no. One, we're going to be at the table. And in 1997, that's why we got the requirement that a general ed teacher was part of the IEP, and that's how we got the requirement that part of the IEP is talking about the supports that are needed for the teacher. So that, when a teacher, whether it's a special ed teacher or a general ed teacher, is going to have a student who may have a rare medical problem and has never had to work with a child with a rare medical problem, they can say, I need some training to do that, and it can be spelled out in the IEP. So a big change, and then monitor. We say a year is a long time, and you say, well, that IEP really isn't working. But you know what, I have too many IEPs to do. I'm not doing another IEP. We'll just wait until next year when it's due. You just lost a year if you put into place a plan that isn't working for a child. Now there is a balance, isn't there? I've got to wait this long. I need to wait a little bit of time to see if it's going to work. But by golly, I'd better, not wait too long because I've lost a lot of time. And remember, the purpose of special education is to ensure that the child receives meaningful benefit. And if they are not making progress and gaining meaningful benefit, is it a problem for us? Yes, it is. One of the saddest, well, actually, I've been involved in a number of them, that were sad that they were allowed to go on so long. But I was called into an IEP, and this was a child with a pretty significant learning disability. And the special education teacher, did pre-test with the reading program she was using, post-test. No progress. None at all. I mean, actually, the test showed 2 months loss. Now, this was allowed to go on all year, and the parent came in wanting extended school year. The school district tried to say, we don't do extended school year for children with learning disabilities. Problem. And, I had to say nicely to the and most school districts, if I don't think they have a case, I'll say, swallow your pride and settle. You're going to lose. I mean, why would you want to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars to prove a point that you're not going to win? I mean, that's just stupid. So a number of them, I say, swallow the pride, settle the case. We did a little, recess in that IEP, and I said, extended school year. You need to do this because you do not want this going to due process. But gosh, if the teacher would have just spoken up and not waited the whole year. I mean, she was using a reading methodology she had to have known was not working, but continued to use it. So monitor in the progress. So those are roles and responsibilities of our teachers. So what are some of the areas of concern? I have 2 Bev Johns laws in special education. One is there is no such thing as unilateral action in special education. Everything goes through the IEP. Now, is that a hard concept for some educators? Yes, it's a very hard concept. They say, by golly, I'm the one who decides who gets accommodated on the test. I have the final say. Oh, no, you don't. It's a team decision. Or he's going to be expelled from school. I don't care if he's special education or not. Out he goes. First of all, expulsion should never even be in the vocabulary of anybody in special education, because you cannot exclude children permanently, never to be seen again. I mean, you have a responsibility to students. So there's no such thing as unilateral action in special education. That's a key concept, and one very hard. And then you have to follow the IEP. Say, well, I know the IEP said that, but we just couldn't get around to doing this, that, and the other. Ooh, ooh, ooh. So, placement, accommodations, behavior intervention plan, parental involvement. We're going to talk more about sometimes how we do accommodations. One size fits all. One size does not fit all. So, now, beware. Failure to evaluate children. This is getting a lot of people in trouble. Some school districts in some states that will remain nameless decided that they were going to make a rule that all children, there had to be the collection of 10 data points before a child could be referred to special education. Can you do that? No. Why? Because if you have knowledge of or suspicion of a disability, you have to evaluate. Knowledge of or suspicion of a disability. You can't say, go home, parent. Or you can't say, look, we're backlogged about a year on evaluations. We don't have the time to do an evaluation. So, and it has major implications for response to intervention. Because again, we're all familiar with the 3-tier model, right? But can we say that, sorry, yes, we know they have a disability, but our rules say until you go through the 3 tiers or the 4 tiers or the 5 tiers, because some schools have 5 tiers, you can't be evaluated. You can't do that. And that's, I'm going to share, we have an Office of Special Education Programs letter that says you can't use RTI as an excuse to delay an evaluation if you have knowledge or suspicion of a disability. And then the failure to recognize independent evaluations. We have a lot of families that go out and get independent evaluations, right? Now, some of the parents will share those independent evaluations. Maybe you've worked with some parents who will not share the results of the independent evaluation. I think they may be afraid that the school will use the evaluation against them. I mean, we don't know. But, so, the failure to recognize the independent evaluation will get you in trouble. Do you have to accept it? No. But do you have to recognize it? So, the parent comes in and says, I took my child to the doctor, and the doctor says he has ADHD. Again, you can't say, well, sorry, we don't serve children with ADHD. Go home. There's a strong movement in a number of states, and yours is one, quite a few of them, dyslexia. And schools would say, we do not recognize dyslexia. That's a medical diagnosis. We don't do anything with it. You still have to recognize, you don't have to accept it, but you have to recognize that there was an evaluation, and if a school district is smart, they'll do their own evaluation to determine whether the child has a reading disability, no matter what they call it. I mean, but you have to do that. And then it's multidisciplinary, meaning it's not one person deciding it, it's a team of people who are deciding. And then ignoring the timelines for an evaluation. So we have timelines at the federal level, and California has timelines, and you have to follow those timelines when you're conducting an evaluation. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question about evaluation. What is your thought about not evaluating when the students are in middle school or high school? What tends to be done now is skip the trial, and then they do what they call review of records.
Review of records,
So they don't test the kids anymore.
Oh, let me tell you. Did everybody hear her question? All right, here was her question. The student is in high school, and they say, well, he's almost, I'm going to paraphrase, but if I'm not correct, you tell me. And the school says, well, he's going to graduate in 2 years anyway. There's no need to do a new evaluation because they're going to be out of here. Remember, yes, they're going to be out of school, but they may want to go into the post-secondary world, namely a college, university, wherever. And they may want accommodations in that setting. Colleges and universities want a current evaluation. They don't want, I can tell you a very sad case where a student came into a college setting and wanted accommodations. The child had not been evaluated, unfortunately, for 10 years. Now, what had to happen? the student had to go to, the rehabilitation services in order to, or pay for a new evaluation. So most of the post-secondary world is not going to accept old evaluations. So again, we need to really think about that when we're doing adequate transition planning for students. What do they want to do? Are they going to need additional evaluations to do that? Yes?
So we have a few questions that have come in from the virtual viewers.
Okay.
Hold off.
Yeah, can we hold off? All righty. And then then remind me, we'll do them. Okay, so the OSEP letter, January 21st, 2011, and that's what it says. RTI cannot be used to delay, deny an evaluation for eligibility under IDEA. Now, I'll tell you my thought about doing evaluations, because sometimes school parents will ask for an evaluation. The school district said, we don't want to do it. I don't think that's worth going to due process over, because what's going to happen is the parent can say, okay, I'm going to take you to due process to show that my child needs an evaluation. Most hearing officers are going to say, do the evaluation. So why not do it on the front end? Now, granted, when the parent wants an evaluation every 6 weeks, we don't do that. But if the parent comes in and has a reason to want an evaluation, we need to be looking whether that's legitimate. And frankly, I wouldn't go to due process myself over doing an evaluation, because if it's a good evaluation, it's going to help you provide better services to the child. And then this one, which is one size doesn't fit all. So, failure to individualize for the needs of the child, the I in the IEP. Computerized IEPs are wonderful, but I can tell you it doesn't matter across the country. I can pick up some IEPs that are so computerized, and all they are is a checklist, and I was an expert witness on a case. The IEP was 35 pages. I read the IEP. It was just one checklist after another, and all they did was just check everything. I read it. I didn't have a clue what that child's needs were. Did not know at all. Because we're supposed to be doing specially designed instruction. So here's another case. Anybody ever been in a dearly beloved IEP? Anybody know what a dearly beloved IEP is? 25 people sitting around, maybe a couple of attorneys there, the school superintendent. I mean, whoa, it was like, dearly beloved, we're gathered here today. Whoa, boy. So, I was invited to one of those, and we're actually making some good, it was going to go to due process, and we're actually making some really good progress. So I noticed we're talking about some accommodations, and we're having a meaningful conversation about the individual accommodations that this child needs. And I think, well, this is wonderful. And I happen to be watching the person who is doing the recording of the information on her computer. And I notice it's like she's pushed away the computer while we're having the discussion. And of course, I'm thinking, well, she's really getting into this discussion, and she's got a good memory, and she's going to be able to write everything down. And so she's not writing anything down. And I thought, so I asked for a recess. And I said to the person doing I said, we're really talking about a lot of good ideas, and we have firmed up some of these, but I noticed that you're not writing them down. Is there a reason for that? Are you going to be doing that later? And she said, oh, no. There's no need to write those accommodations down in those school districts. In this school district, we do it for all the kids. Here's the problem with that. It's called portability And it goes back to my stranger test that I talk about for children with behavior problems. Our kids move. So they move from one school district to another school district, and the school district picks it up and says, well, he doesn't need any accommodations. Oh, yeah, we just automatically did those things in this school district. Does the new school district know that? No. Or the other sad one is co-teaching. So the IEP showed 100% general ed classroom. Child moved. Got the IEP, 3 weeks into the year, they're following the IEP. It just said monitor, no direct service time. So, said, better call the school district, the previous school district. And the person said, well, all the classes the student was in were all co-taught. There was a special ed teacher in there and there was a general ed teacher. Was it written on the IEP? No. So here the new school district thinks 100% in general ed. 100% in general ed with a special ed co-teacher. So those things need to be written down on the IEP. This is, what is special education? It's, again, specially designed instruction. It's not just accommodations and modifications. It's not just differentiated instruction in the general ed class. It's specially designed instruction. So you're saying, well, accommodations and specially designed instruction are the same thing. Oh, no, they are absolutely not. So here's my example. I have Billy who comes into my classroom, and he's in high school, and he's reading at the 2nd grade level. We say, oh, no problem. We'll read the text to him. No problem at all. We'll accommodate him. Are you teaching him to read in the way he can learn to read? And if the answer is no, you're not doing your job. I mean, we don't just accommodate. We accommodate, yes, but we better be teaching him to read. It's like, what's the most common accommodation? Extended timelines. Let me tell you, extended timelines will not do you any good if you haven't been taught the material. And if you haven't been taught how to manage your time. Because a lot of kids who say, okay, I got 2 hours to do it, it's no big deal, put my head down on the desk, because they don't know how to manage their time. It's kind of like I always say to people, oh, this was a few years back when people weren't using their phones and they were using the Garmin. I got lost one night, Saturday night, coming back from a workshop, and so in the city of Chicago, by myself in the city. I don't have a clue because I live downstate. Thinking, what am I going to do? So later I'm telling my brother, oh gosh, I got lost in the city of Chicago, blah, 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 blah. So for Christmas he gets me a Garmin. Thinks, well, this has solved your problem. I'm accommodating you. Did I know how to use the Garmin? No, I did not. So did it do me any good? No. I needed specially designed instruction. So, and it's too bad in my school career I wasn't given specially designed instruction for my lack of a sense of direction, because maybe I wouldn't have gotten lost. So this is specially designed instruction, which is delivered by the special educator based on a thorough assessment, and it's a mixture of remediating and teaching the child how to compensate for the problem, and it also includes related service. Differentiation is delivered by the general ed, and accommodations, which don't change content, modifications monkey with the content, delivered within the general ed classroom, and it's really the responsibility of the teacher, the classroom teacher, and a special education teacher. I think sometimes we do a real disservice to our general ed teachers by not working together with them to develop the accommodations and just assuming that they know how to accommodate the student, and they may not. So, now, we talked about LRE, right? FAPE in the LRE. Least restrictive environment. The state of California had the very famous Rachel Holland case. How many of you know the Rachel Holland case? I use this case all the time, even though I don't live in the Ninth Circuit, but the other circuits used the Rachel Holland case because it gave us the four-pronged test for how do we determine least restrictive environment. And what happened was little Rachel Holland was a little girl with intellectual disabilities. She didn't have any behavior problems. She was young, she had intellectual disabilities. And her parents wanted her in a general ed class. And the school district said, nope, nope, nope. No general ed for her. Special ed class. That's what everybody with intellectual disabilities gets, you know, special ed class. And the parents said, well, wait a minute. We really think that she could benefit from the general ed class. So the school district says, okay, we got a deal for you. She can bebop back and forth. General ed, general ed, special ed, 6 times a day, move her back and forth and back and forth. And the parents said, well, wait a minute, she's losing a lot of instructional time, bebopping back and forth. We want her in general ed. Parents won. Why did they win? 4-pronged test. Will the student derive educational benefit? Will the student derive non-educational benefit, like social skills from being around her appropriate peer group? Will there be a detriment because she's disruptive and the teacher can't teach? And what's the cost of the proposed placement? And yes, you can use cost. Now, they said Rachel Holland can derive educational benefit. She can get social skills. She is not disruptive to the other children, and the placement doesn't cost, and therefore the school district lost the Rachel Holland case back in 1994, and that is still, everybody refers to that. Now then, in the same circuit, but up in the state of Washington, there was a young man, my kind of child. He was disruptive. And so the parents said, we want him in the general ed class. School district said, look, he can't be in the general ed class. He had significant behavior problems. He had Tourette's syndrome, and he engaged in sexually harassing behavior. So he was disruptive. Critical to this case, though, in the state of Washington, was that the school district had really tried to provide him an appropriate behavior management plan, and it wasn't working. And so the court said the disruptive behavior kept him from learning, and he has an overwhelmingly negative effect on teachers and other students. And they said, the same circuit said, this third prong of the test takes priority over the other ones. Now, they would not have won this case, again, if they'd have said, well, we just don't bother with children with behavior problems. They had shown in writing what they did, and it wasn't working. So, very important. Okay, and collaborating with families. So I see so many school districts get into adversarial relationships with families, sometimes over little things. But it kind of becomes a power struggle, if you will, to see who's really in control. But we need to recognize the needs of the family. Any of you heard Rick LaVoy speak? Well, He's a wonderful speaker. He talks about the waterbed effect of having a child in your family who has a disability. And he says it's like the whole family is on a waterbed all the time. Because what happens with that child impacts the whole family. Some of you may have a relative in your family or your own child who has a disability. I can tell you in my family we have a child who has a disability, and the child is my niece and nephews. So when he has a bad day at school, guess what happens? All right, so his mother and father are upset. They then call grandma and grandpa, who then become upset. And then grandma and grandpa call me, and, I'm trying to help out. And my husband's saying, what's going on now? Waterbed effect impacts the whole family. And sometimes if we can just think about that and the pressure that the families are having, recognizing their positive actions, their right to disagree, linking them to available services, seeking their input. I was caught in on another case. I was going to do process over a homeschool journal. I thought, how can this be happening? Homeschool journal is supposed to be a nice thing to do. Except the special ed teacher was really getting carried away with the negative. She really needed somebody else to read it before she sent it home to the family. Because it was, today he had a bad day. He couldn't do this, he couldn't do that, he couldn't do that. So what was supposed to be positive wasn't positive because people were getting carried away focusing on what the child could not do during the day as opposed to what the child could do during the day. Okay, let's do another two truths and a lie. One of these statements is a lie. Which one? If the parent can only attend an IEP on Saturday, then the school district must schedule the meeting on Saturday. Under certain circumstances, the school can hold the IEP if the parent can't attend. And the third one is parental concerns must be addressed at the IEP. All right, stand up if you think number one is a lie. Or you can raise your hand if you don't want to stand up, but I thought you might need a little exercise. Okay, all righty, thank you. You can sit back down. And stand up if you think number two is a lie. And stand up if you think number one is a lie. Okay. Everybody got it right. So you all get applause. Good deal. So the bottom line is the IEP is a team effort. And we talked about there's no such thing as unilateral action in special ed. All right, tell me whether these statements are right or wrong. The principal decides the testing accommodations. Wrong? Okay, wrong. No. But do some think they do? Yes, they do. All right, the next one. The teacher changes the time the student sees the speech and language pathologist. Right or wrong? Wrong. And the teacher sends a student home for the rest of the day because of the student's behavior. Wrong. This is what happens a lot. And then, now when you send the child home for the rest of a day, is that a suspension? It's like a duck is a duck. It's a suspension. Now, people aren't keeping records. So, we might have the teacher sending the child home some days. We might have the dean sending a child home some days. We might have the principal sending a child, and pretty soon we're up to 25 days, and nobody knows because nobody was keeping data on the number of times the child was sent home. And then it becomes what? A suspension. Now, gotta watch my time because anybody remember this is my favorite case in the whole wide world. Anybody remember this case? It's classic, and I'll tell you why I like it. It seems that in the state of West Virginia, there was a young man named Douglas Doe. And Douglas Doe was in a history class. And Douglas Doe had a learning disability, and Douglas Doe needed the test read to him. That was his accommodation. It was on an IEP. But guess who his history teacher was? It was a man named Mr. Withers, who was a state legislator. Now, in many states, you can't be a teacher and a state legislator because, it might take up too much of your time and take you out of the classroom. But that was not the case in West Virginia back in 1994. So, Mr. Withers, having a large ego, says, I'm not making accommodations for him, and I can do what I want. And written in the IEP, school principal went to Mr. Withers and said, the IEP says this, you got to do it. And he says, bug off, I'm not doing it. And the superintendent goes to Mr. Withers and says, you've got to make those accommodations because Douglas Doe is on a sports team. And because he failed the history exam, guess what? He couldn't play sports. Ooh, ooh, ooh. So the parent says, this is ridiculous. We're going to court over this. Mr. Withers is saying, go ahead, who cares? So the principal had written down that he had talked to Mr. Withers and said, Douglas Doe needs accommodations. Superintendent had documented, Douglas Doe needs accommodations. Mr. Withers says, ain't doing it, too bad, so sad. And Mr. Withers was sued personally to the tune of $30,000. Now, how many people have an extra $30,000 sitting around to prove a point which he didn't prove? The point being, the school district didn't lose the case. They sued Mr. Withers personally. Now, a lot of people say, I can't be sued personally. I'm immune from that. No, you're not. And you're seeing more cases of people doing some not so good things to children, and they are being sued personally out of their pocket. So when some teachers occasionally say they're not going to make accommodations, you might want to say, do you want to be sued personally? However, be alert that some teachers are not wanting to make accommodations because they don't know how. I mean, or they have a fear of doing the wrong thing. So, but in this case, that was not the deal with Mr. Withers. He was acting in bad faith. So our IEP includes the student's background, evaluation results, strengths, that's a requirement. Present levels of achievement and functional performance, MOO terms, everything written, measurable, observable, objective, so a stranger can understand exactly what it says. And then we do goals and where appropriate objectives, and then where do we meet those goals? So that's kind of the flow chart, if you will, of what we're doing. We don't just say, okay, let's decide what placement he needs. Well, wait a minute. What are his needs? And all of this should follow beautifully. Might not always, but it should. All right, so Let's do a little game with, are these statements written in moo terms? So if I get and I will tell you, I get IEPs, and you might get IEPs that say, Dakota is truant. Is that measurable, observable, and objective? No. Truant, what are we talking about? Is he absent 10% of the time, or is he absent 80% of the time? And we know absences now are a big issue across the country. How about this one? Kiara can't read. Well, whoopee, that tells me a lot, doesn't it? Is that moo? No. And Blaine has weak math skills. Anybody ever seen that on an IEP? Yes. I have a lot of them. And I say, oh, these are not moo terms. Why do they have to be moo? Well, because, remember, we got to show meaningful benefit. And if we don't know exactly where the child is, how do we know what progress they're making? We don't. And we need data. All righty, here is another one. I didn't see it happen. Failure to provide adequate supervision. Do we get into that? Issues with paraeducators. Do you have any paraeducators in the audience? Again, you know, my hats are off to paraprofessionals, but we are expecting them to do things for which they are not trained or qualified to do. And ultimately, the teacher is responsible for the education of the child, not the paraeducator. And issues with bullying, pumping up supervision, don't ignore aggression. It's a wonderful book by Research Press and Arnold Goldstein, which is Low-Level Aggression, First Steps in the Ladder of High-Level Aggression. And we get into some real problems in our schools because we're not providing adequate supervision, or we're seeing children bully other children and we're not doing anything about it. So, because sometimes we don't want to see things that happen. So, and here's my other law. Remember I told you no such thing as unilateral action in special ed? If it isn't written down, it wasn't done. So you have asked for an evaluation on a child, but you just talked to somebody about it. Did you write down the request? No. People are going to say, how do we know you really did it? Or, did you really invite the parent to the IEP? Oh yeah, I called him on the phone. So do you have written documentation of the phone call that you made to the parent? No. It doesn't do you any good. I mean, we're all in the business of what? Documenting what we do in writing, dating it, who we talk to, all of that. I've just seen so many school districts get in trouble over that. Okay, because here's the whole process of written documentation. Event happens or a request is made. You say, I really believe this child needs to be evaluated. You put it in writing, and you make sure you keep a copy of it. So then you may have oral followed by writing, which is proof of your action. And then this one, which is stranger test portability. When you write an IEP, you need to go back and review that IEP and say, can a stranger understand this? If the child moves from X district to Y district, could somebody pick up that IEP and know exactly what to do with the child? And so that's the whole portability issue. And then any written documentation has to be objective. Sometimes we put things in writing and they say, where's your proof of that? They had somebody who was doing an FBA last week. I looked at it and she says, I know he can do the makeup work. How do you know he can do the makeup work? What's the documentation for, I know he can do the makeup work, is not objective, is it? It's a subjective statement. I could say, I know he can do the makeup work based on X test scores, or based on my work with him in this area. And then a record, this is where we get into FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. If you write something down and you share it with anybody, it's part of the record. So, do I have any social workers in here? All right, social workers sometimes keep private records. They do not share them with anybody. But once they share them, or anybody shares a record, well, it's just my own personal log about the student. Did you share the contents of that log with somebody else? If you did, it's a record, and therefore the parent has a right to review that record and have a copy of that record. And FERPA, temporary records versus permanent records. Trust me, if I go back to my high school and look at my permanent records, there's hardly anything there. All of you go back, there's not anything there. Because special education records, discipline records, etc. are temporary records, and according to your state, they're destroyed after a period of time. The school district gives notice to the parents or the student that those records are available, and then they're removed. And we talked about in destruction of records, be very careful. All of your schools have to have records custodians, and you need to know who your records custodian is. Because, again, the parent has the right to the records. Because you're actually just watching the records when they belong ultimately to the student and the family. You can charge for the copies of the records, but they have a right to the records. Okay, so let's do a quick. Okay, and we have a question. All right, so grades, are they permanent or temporary records? Permanent records generally are grades. Special ed evaluations? Temporary. 504 plan? 504 plan is temporary. Nothing in a record could ever disclose, other than a temporary record, can disclose that they were ever getting any services that have anything to do with a disability. Basic identifying information such as birth date, permanent. Special ed classes taken. It's a temporary record. Okay, and just presenting a positive image, check and recheck anything sent to someone else. Share only with those who need to know, and avoid any negative statements about the profession and individual children. We need to be positive about our work with children. We don't want to give anybody ammunition to bash educators. We have enough of that, unfortunately, going on. Okay, we're gonna take some questions.
There's 3 of them here written.
Okay, good. Because we're almost out of time. Okay. Can preschooler who has ADHD diagnosis receive IEP services? If so, what category would they qualify under? Okay, very good question. What would be the first thing the school district would have to do with the preschooler? Evaluate. They would have to evaluate the child, decide whether the child needed services. If a pediatrician has given a note stating this preschooler needs an aide for 4 hours of program, is the school district obligated to provide the aide? No. That would be considered an independent evaluation. Would you have to do it? No. Would you have to consider it? Sure you would. So that's a really good question. If a child, these are a lot of preschool ones, if a preschooler is advanced in their cognitive reasoning development, but behavior, social, emotional impacts their ability to maintain in a typical class, can they receive IEP services with behavior being primary diagnosis? All righty, what would be the first thing you would have to do? Once again, the critical piece is that you have to evaluate. Because if that child has behavior problems, is it important that you evaluate? Yes, it is. If you read any of the work of Hill Walker, Jim Kaufman incidentally has a brand new book out called The Scandalous Neglect of Mental Health in the Schools. If you haven't read the book, short book, very to the point. He says we engage in developmental optimism, thinking that our little bitties are going to outgrow problems. We need to be evaluating them and determining what services they need. So, okay, so let's take some, we've got 5 minutes left, some questions. Yes, ma'am. Oh, The Scandalous Neglect of Mental Health in the Schools, and it's by James Kaufman, who is a very big name in the field of behavior, working with children with behavior problems. He has written a lot on developmental optimism and how we just think kids will outgrow problems, and we know they won't. We need to assess and give them services. So thank you for asking that. It's just a small book, but it's powerful. Other questions that anyone has? Okay, well, if you want to read more, just to close, our role in moving forward. Ask ourselves, are we keeping abreast of new laws and regulations? Are we putting the needs of our students first? And are we collaborators? And if you want to read more about special ed law, there's the Classroom Guide to Special Education Law. So, anything else that anyone wants to ask? Oh, yes, ma'am. Oh, okay. Her question is there one blog, or more? I always do Smart Brief. You can do Smart Brief through the Council for Exceptional Children or the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. It's free, and you'll get a daily update, but Council for Exceptional Children Smart Brief, that's a good one to read because it kind of gives you what's happening across the United States. There are a couple other blogs that I wouldn't be without. One is Diane Ravitch's blog. I read that a lot. It's very thought-provoking. So that is a good one. Fred Klonsky has a very good one as well. So I think those are three, if you will, that I make a point to read every day. So, if you're not in the mood to read, you can just delete them, but, I try to keep up with them every day. Somebody else had a question. Yeah.
I have a question to follow up about the evaluation. How do you advocate for your students when the administrator said no, you don't need to evaluate them? And then so what happened is the psychologists call the parents and say, we're just going to go and do the review of records because the cognitive part is not going to change. He's old enough now, and so they decide that, and then the parents said, okay, just do the review of records.
Yeah, did you hear her question was about review of records versus evaluation? You have a professional obligation if you think the child should be retested to put that in writing. They don't have to do it, but you at least have gone on record that you thought that was a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you all for being here.